Lovely. Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Avid Readers' Zoom session for the launch of Jamie Simmonds' new book, Rising from the Flood, Moving the Town of Grantham. I hope that you're all well, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your patience in the waiting room as I admitted you all. This is still quite new for us all at Avid Reader, but we seem to be getting it right in a lot of ways, and we're really excited to be able to host events with you this way at the moment, given the circumstances we're all in. But we obviously can't wait to see you in store again as soon as this is all over. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'll shortly be introducing you to our speakers tonight, but I'd first like to reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email that you were all sent earlier. In order to reduce the potential for any disruptions, all of our participants, including the cats next door, sorry about them, all of our participants are currently on mute. I'm unfortunately unable to offer any technical support, but if you adjust your Zoom settings to speaker view, which should be at the top right hand side of your screen, then you'll be able to see our speakers this evening fill your screen, as hopefully I am for you all now. At the end of the event, we'll be taking questions. All of your questions will be taken via the chat box, and I will read them out to the speakers who will then address you. I'll do my best to get through all of your questions before the event concludes, which will be in 1 hour's time at 7:30 p.m. So enough from me. I'd now like to introduce Jamie Simmonds. Born in the central New York town of Auburn, Jamie Simmonds was awarded an athletic scholarship to Pennsylvania State University, where he graduated in 1997 with a degree in environmental engineering. Jamie moved to Australia in 2001 and lives in Brisbane with his wife and kids. Jamie spent most of his early career working in local and state government. He was appointed to the role of project director of the multi-award-winning Strengthening Grantham project, and successfully directed the relocation of the town of Grantham following flooding in 2011. Jamie now works in the property development industry and has been invited to speak at the 2020 Brisbane Writers' Festival, as well as appearing on ABC's Conversations with Sarah Kanowski and Osher Gunsberg's Better Than Yesterday podcast. In conversation with Jamie this evening, we have Christine Jackman. In almost 3 decades as a journalist, Christine has travelled from Brisbane, where she began as a cadet at the Courier Mail, to New York as a foreign correspondent, Canberra as a member of the Press Gallery, and Sydney, where she won several awards as a feature writer for The Australian. She has covered numerous election campaigns, including the US presidential race, and is also the author of Inside Kevin 07, detailing Labor's victory in 2007. She's a regular guest on ABC Radio, and her next book will be published in September 2020. So Christine and Jamie, please take it from here.
Thanks very much. And thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. I am just firstly going to reiterate one thing, because I know for those who haven't used Zoom before, it tricked me up originally. And that's, if you look down, there's the chat button. If you'd like to ask questions tonight, the chat thing is just at the bottom of your screen. To click on that and you'll be able to file your questions there for later. So I have seen countless people suddenly look very confused when they want to ask a question and not know where to do that. But yeah, I'd like to just start by taking you all back to a day that I think, for those of us who live in Brisbane or in southeast Queensland, frankly, I think it's one of those days that will always be in your memory. You'll know where you were, what you were doing. For me, I remember on the 10th of January 2011, sitting at my kitchen table writing, because I was running from home that day, and listening to rolling ABC coverage of a storm cell that had broken over the ranges and Toowoomba in particular. And I think for those of us who had lived through that summer of almost constant rain, at first it didn't seem particularly confronting. But then very quickly we started getting those reports in, mainly from helicopter journalists, saying that this was really, there was a big disaster unfolding. And sure enough, it was in the town of Grantham, which is, I think a lot of people have never heard of before. Little town of 600 people. There were 12 people who died by the end of that disaster, and I think more than 100 houses destroyed, which is pretty amazing to imagine that a region which isn't that large could suffer that much damage. Lockyer Valley Mayor Steve Jones, at the time when journalists like me were wading through neck-deep water in Brisbane as the Brisbane River carried that deluge down river, Steve Jones, who was a bit of a local identity already, picked up the phone and rang Jamie Simmonds and said, "I need your help." So I'd like to ask Jamie first and foremost, do you remember where you were at that time and and how that phone call came to pass?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And thanks everybody for coming along. I do remember that day quite vividly, and it was an unusual day for me because I was actually mowing my lawn that day. It was, and some might remember, it was a bit of blue sky. It was quite a nice, peaceful day, and I, like you, remember seeing the ABC and people on roofs in Grantham. I wasn't really aware of Grantham, although I had been in Gatton many times before that. But it was a real sort of surreal atmosphere for me. And I remember seeing Steve on TV, and at that time I knew Steve, and just a bit of concern that, geez, this could be overwhelming. I hope they get through this. But I was just at home doing my thing and couldn't get in the city because the buildings were all shut down because they'd flooded. And then it was a few days after that when I got the call from Steve, asked if I could come and give him a hand.
Now, I'm just going to stop you right there because I think the obvious problem, and we foreshadowed it in the introduction, is that I've been around regional Queensland as a journalist long enough to know you don't get an accent like that one very often once you move outside of Brisbane. Very, very rare. So can you tell me a little bit more about, before we get to meeting Steve Jones, how did you come to be a boy from New York State, be in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, I get that a lot, particularly in Grantham. I didn't they knew I wasn't from around those parts. But so I grew up in central New York, a couple hours outside of New York City. I call it redneck New York because it's really, about,
isn't it? A lot of people having lived and been based in New York City, people don't realize that there's a whole state that's just completely different world.
Yes. It's very rural where I grew up. We didn't grow up with any cattle, but there were cattle in the farm just behind my backyard. And, so I was from a rural region, really. And growing up, of course, Australia was, might as well have been the moon. It was cool and exciting, and you'd see it on TV, but the thought of actually going there wasn't something I ever, I thought going to Canada was pretty cool, and that was 2 hours away. So, as I got a bit older and I went through college and graduated, and I worked on a golf course to save up a bit of money. I was mowing greens at the time, and my brother said, "You want to go to Europe?" And I said, "Yeah, let's do it. Let's go." And we didn't know what we were going to do. We just got the backpacks and landed in London, and then just started backpacking around. And lo and behold, a few days, it wasn't even far into the trip where I ran into my now wife.
Give us a little bit more details. It was a sort of a walked into a crowded room situation, wasn't it?
Yes, well, it was in a pub, which, typical thing.
Australians are when they're
Exactly right. So it was no surprise that her and her cousin, two Australians, were sitting in a pub drinking beer. And I thought, and actually they asked us to sit down. So we're like, okay, it was a crowded bar. My brother and I were there. We, still jet lagged, didn't know what to do. We were still figuring out pounds versus dollars, and had a beer and sat down. And I guess from there, we all started traveling around together as backpackers do, and as Australians do, they just sort of jump on and go. We traveled around for 6 weeks, and then I decided I like this traveling thing. So
I
the
thought you
first.
like the girl.
Oh, well, the girl was important too. Yes, of course. And I thought, wow, she's from Australia too. It's, you know, two birds with one stone. This is great. You know, great woman and a great country to go to. So I followed her to Australia and first set foot in Australia in 1998 in Brisbane.
Mm-hmm.
And she was from Brisbane and her family lived in Brisbane. And yeah, it was just a great place to be. And I just felt really, really comfortable. And, you know, yes, for the first couple years, I had trouble understanding people and I couldn't tell an English accent from an Aussie accent, from a Kiwi accent, you know. And of course, the minute I opened my mouth, everybody knew where I was from.
On me, I have to, when I've lived over there, people, you know, would say you're a New Zealander or South African. So I understand the pain.
That's right. But, you know, I mean, I still think Brisbane's the best place in the world to live. So, you know, and I've been around a bit, but so, you know, we lived back in America for a year or so. Well, I actually went to dental school in America for a couple of years. And so I was there with my now wife, Beck, and she could work in Canada and I went to school in America. And so she crossed the border every day. And then we decided we got sick of winters and shoveling the car out after a big snowstorm, as you can probably remember in New York.
Real shock. I mean, the change from Brisbane climate to New York, a place where they've actually got 4 seasons.
That's right.
Both very hot summers, but brutally cold winters. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's really just hard living. So I thought, well, I can have 360 days of sunshine a year here in Brisbane. So we moved back.
So tell me, from there, 1998, it's still a big leap, Brisbane, in the late 90s, to working with a fellow called Steve Jones. And I think some of your descriptions of Steve in your book are the most delightful and just impactful parts of the book. So tell us a bit about Steve. Paint a picture.
Yeah. So Steve was, you know, there's not many Steves left anymore, I don't think. You know, they're a dying breed. They're that rural sort of regional leader that just says whatever the hell he wants and, you know, pisses a whole lot of people off in the process. But most people can't help but be attracted to the guy. You know, most people can't help but see those qualities in a person like Steve. So that's who he was. He was born and raised around cattle and farms and trucks and, you know, all that sort of stuff. He slept like 3 hours a day, you know. So he was just
big guy, right?
Big guy, big fat bald guy, and just full life. You know, he would have lived 3 lives, you know. When I first met him, it's kind of funny because he was a mayor at the time when I first met him, and nobody forgot meeting Steve Jones. Nobody ever said, Steve Jones, yeah, no, I don't remember him. No, I mean, you remember him. So the first time I met him, I had to present to him in a big committee meeting, and he was chairing the committee. And, you know, for days in advance, everyone's like, oh, geez, ooh, be careful with Steve. Oh, you got to go talk to Steve. Oh, this is going to be great. And, you know, I'd ask people for help. I'm like, you know, did you want to come into the meeting and give me a hand? They're like, no, you know, I'm busy that day. I've got a few meetings and no, can't do that.
Getting nervous, or
I was getting a little nervous, and I'm not really a stressed out sort of guy, you know, but I got to say my palms were a little sweaty walking into that meeting. But, you know, I remember that meeting very clearly, and he just liked my style, I guess. And, you know, I was expecting a couple of, you know, shots thrown at me, but he just smiled and couldn't really understand what he said. Because by that time, that was like 2008. So I kind of knew the Australian accent pretty well, but he came from a different world where, you know, his Australian accent, there were probably a lot of Australians who couldn't understand. My wife always said it was hard for her to understand him.
One long vowel.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
But did he ever tell you? Because it's a big deal, Jamie, isn't it? I mean, to think that you worked with him, but you'd finished your project, hadn't you, by the time he called you to ask for help? So you obviously made an impact on him. Did he ever let on what it was about you?
You know, we probably never had that conversation exactly, but I think what it was with him is he trusted very few people. You know, he was friends with a lot of people. He had a lot of friends, and he had a lot of people that looked up to him, and he was on the phone constantly, and he couldn't walk down the street without seeing somebody. But there was only a small group of people that he actually trusted. And I think the reason he trusted me was just, we were quite different in a lot of ways, but we were similar in a lot of ways. You know, we were both kind of go-getters, you know, we were both sort of enthusiastic, passionate about things. And I guess he saw in me someone who had come through as essentially a bureaucrat. You know, I worked in local and state government for years, but not the type of bureaucrat that would slow things down, the type that would look for ways around things and get things done. And I think he really appreciated that about me. And we had a lot of fun together. We had a lot of laughs. So
what did he say to you in that phone call? What did he tell you he wanted you to do?
Well, you know, he was short on details. He just sort of called me up. He said, you know, hey, how you doing? Of course, that was always how he did. He asked you how you were doing. You know, he's fighting a flood and he's asking me how I'm doing. Yeah. That was his style. But he just said, can you come and give me a hand? You know, that was it. That was my job description, you know.
What did you say?
I said, yeah. When do you want me? He said, can you get out here tomorrow morning? I said, I'll find a way. Because at the time, a lot of the roads were
It was hard enough to drive around Brisbane, because I was doing a lot of work around Brisbane, and you just had to make massive detours, or you'd get to the end of a road and it'd just be a lake. So you had to turn.
That's right. So it took me 3 hours to get out there, which normally it's about an hour 20.
Yeah.
And I had a whole bunch of detours. I had to smile to a couple of cops here and there and, you know, tell them what I was doing. But yeah, so I got out there and that was my job description, you know, give me a hand.
Do you remember, like, what were your first impressions driving in? Because this is the other thing I find about, I've been on the ground in both bushfires, like when the fire went through Canberra, and also when, you know, the really worst parts of Brisbane when they were flooded. And I think that's the hardest thing is to actually describe to people. And I think, again, in your book, you do this well. Just it's surreal, isn't it?
It is. And nothing can prepare you for it. I mean, there's nothing quite like what I felt when I first went into Grantham. And, you know, it's very hard to describe what you saw. Like, you can go and look at videos and you can go and look at pictures, but that doesn't do it justice. I mean, it's a feeling, you know, it's like just complete destruction, and you could feel the weight on people's shoulders. You could just feel it. And for me, a lot of it was the smell. You know, I'll never forget the smell of just mud, but not good mud, you know, dirty mud. And it just permeated everything, you know, and it was really, it was emotional, you know, going in there.
Emotional for you, why? Tell me, because you didn't know Grantham. Just
right. I think it's just that feeling of, and I'm not, to be honest, I'm not a real emotional guy, but these sorts of things come out, and I think it's just that feeling of this community is gonna struggle. You know, this community it's gonna be a very, very difficult road back to where they need to be. That was probably emotion for me.
For those of us who may not have been, you know, here or seeing lots of the images, I'm going to ask you, I remember seeing one of several cars jammed up against a railway bridge. I mean, can you tell me some of the other things like that really you'll tell a guest here? What's you seeing?
Well, that bridge was one, and it had, I can't remember how many vehicles stuck in there, but I think it was dozens. I mean, it was incredible.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The frightening thing about that is I remember there were several people missing, people who had gone missing in cars.
Yes.
So I just didn't know if one of those cars might have contained a human being.
That's right. And so they were picking through this debris, pulling apart this stuff, trying to find bodies, really. And it's pretty grim. And when I came in, they were still looking for bodies. There was still a lot of missing people. And, you know, you just saw SES and Army volunteers, well, not volunteers, Army personnel, just walking through the fields with pokers, just arm in arm, scanning the whole area, going through houses. And I remember one home, they found human remains on the fourth time they searched the home.
Oh, gosh.
So that's how devastating it really was. So they'd searched the home a number of times before. I remember too, kind of a funny one is, I remember a BMW, a red BMW, stuck up in a tree. You know, it was like 3 meters off the ground in a tree. And it stayed there for weeks because I think they weren't sure how they were going to get it down without killing themselves. But this was the kind of thing that you saw, and people were just getting on with the cleanup, getting on with trying to deal with it. And there's a red BMW stuck up in a tree. You know, it's bizarre. It's very bizarre.
Yes. So, what was Steve's plan? At what point, or more the point, what did he say? At what point did he say, we're going to move the entire town?
Yeah. So that idea came out essentially the morning after the flood, and I talk about that in my book. Yeah, that really at that point for Steve, it was just sort of this idea that we can't build back where all this devastation occurred. I mean, how can someone put their child to bed at night in the same place where someone lost their life, you know, or knowing that, you know, it starts raining at midnight. How do you sleep? You know, it's that reality, that basic reality. And that was Steve to a T. It's just basic instinct. He's not thinking about it any more than just instinctually, you know.
It's interesting though, Jamie, because that's one of the things you say, you know, they're not big on emotions out in, you know, showing emotions out that way. And yet that level of, I think, emotional intelligence and empathy, a lot of people would have just been thinking, we just got to clean this up and find bodies and tick boxes and that's all really important. But that's one of the things that surprised me is the recognition from him so quickly that we have to move the town, not because it's going to be flooded again, which obviously was you know, a big risk, but the trauma that had happened there.
That's it. And that, you know, when I first came out there, and that's probably one reason why Steve always trusted me and liked me, I knew that at the same instant he did. You know, it wasn't about fixing infrastructure. It wasn't about fixing homes. It wasn't about building fences back. It was about the welfare of the human mind in a community like that. You know, how do people cope? And I guess if you extrapolate that out, people won't put their child to bed at night in that space, which means they moved away. And everybody knows these regional towns, you lose 10, 15, 20, 30 people. It's a ghost town, because in that 30 people, there's a teacher, there's you know, the guy who mows my lawns, there's the butcher, there's the shop owner. And once you lose those people in a small regional community, you lose the whole community. Becomes a ghost town.
Yeah, so that leads me to, I mean, it would be easy to think, you know, you read a book that says, or see a book that says Rising from the Flood, Moving the Town of Grantham, and it's written by somebody with an engineering background. You think it's going to be about lifting up houses and building roads.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of that sort of stuff in there, but it sounds like to me that a lot of your challenge, a lot of your time was actually getting your head around how do we keep this community together. Is that right?
That's exactly it.
When did you and Steve first start engaging with the community? Because they weren't allowed back in originally, were they?
No, so they were sort of kept out for a little while as best we could because of the trauma that was there. You know, they didn't want people walking around areas where they were looking for human remains, you know, and that was a balancing act, and it was difficult. But the community was always sort of being engaged. And in those early days, there was a tent set up at the school, and every night we'd have meetings. And it was really just, and that was probably where you could really understand the people side of things. You know, people were just going there to connect with friends, to connect with their community. And they were painful times for a lot of people. You know, that's where you'd see grown men in tears, and, you know, you'd have people crying on my shoulder, and I'm not trained for that. You know, but like I said, I'm an engineer, but, you know, this is the reality. And this is where you start to realize, you know, building a residential estate, you know, for anyone who's done it, the technical side of things is pretty straightforward. And we had some great people helping us, you know, Peter Smith, who's in the book, and Cameron Davies, our architect. You know, we had some fantastic people helping us, but they were really there was a million guys that could have helped us build an estate. But what they were really good at understanding too, like Steve and I, was this wasn't about building a residential estate. This was about rebuilding a community from the ground up, you know.
And I should add, for those who don't know, just to add a degree of difficulty, Steve had decided that was January, that this was all going to happen by Christmas.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. He wasn't afraid to put it out there, you know, and he did in a big way. And a big reason he did that is because if you said to a community like that, hey guys, you know, we're gonna help you. We're gonna even say we're gonna move you up on the hill, but just stick with us for 5 years. We'll get you up there. We got a bit of red tape we got to cut through. People would have just walked away, you know. But if you say, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna move you. See that hill there? We're gonna move you right there, and you will be living in that home by Christmas. You know, when you stand up in front of a group and say those sorts of things, people get hopeful. And because it was Steve, and because he had people around him that could do it, people believed him. They might not like, you know, not everybody likes Steve, of course, but that's leadership, you know. And when he said that, I think a lot of people said, all right, well, we're gonna give him a chance. We're gonna give these guys a chance here and see what we got, you know. And that was about bringing in hope.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful message that can be applied to a lot of situations. Is that it wasn't like it was just everyone went, yes, we're going to move up the hill. There was a lot of challenges that you faced there with keeping people together. Mm-hmm. And I get the sense that, you know, pretty quickly you realized if you didn't deliver on something, that was that. You could lose people. Yeah. And that's a burden.
That's it.
Isn't it?
It is. And, you know, I talk about it in the book that, you know, I talk about myself and Steve, you know, you carry, it's a double-edged sword, you know, you carry that weight of hope of a community on your shoulders, and you don't want to show any fear that you're not going to get there, but you also realize, you know, in some cases, these people's lives are counting on our actions. And, you know, mental health, domestic violence, suicide, those were all real things. Alcoholism and drug, I mean, we would see it at the evening meetings. A lot of people came drunk, you know, and you could see it. And so you carried that weight, and it was, you know, I wouldn't change a thing, but it's a heavy burden for those people to carry.
Yeah, I mean, under those sorts of times of immense stress where everything's been thrown up in the air and there's nothing's normal, and that sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it, right now? But those times you tend to see both the best and the worst of human behaviour. It's a crash course. And I'd imagine you learnt a bit about Absolutely. How people operate. Can you tell me a little bit? I mean, what were some of the things, if I said, what do you know about human beings that maybe you didn't know before then?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. You know, Steve used to have a great saying that, you know, you stand on the street corner and you hand out $50 notes, and you'll get one person that spits in your face and says, you know, I wanted 2 20s and a 10, you know, and this is what happens, you know, in a disaster. Some people are just ready to go. They're resilient. They're built for this, and they hook in and they fix up. Some people just sit down and just don't want to get up. Other people their outlet is just lashing out and telling everybody they're bastards and get the hell out of here, and, you know, and getting on the booze or whatever it is. And we saw all of that. And let me tell you, we got into some almighty fights with, well, just about everybody, to be honest. But, but, you know, a lot of people in Grantham, no, I shouldn't say a lot, but there was certainly a portion of people in Grantham that just, you know, were traumatized. You know, and in hindsight, when I look back at it, that's what it was. At the time, you kind of get pissed off because you're like, geez, we're doing all this, you know, can you cut us a break? But looking back, you know, I mean, these people lost family, they lost friends, they lost everything they owned. Yeah, you know, they got a right to be pissed off. And some of them were.
And often, in my observation, after things like that, there's often trauma specialists, counsellors, all those sorts of people, you know, who will be assigned to go into those sorts of communities. But you know, knowing Queensland, having grown up here, I know that the last thing nobody's going to talk to a person from out of town. So, like it or not, it sounds like you, because they knew you from around, they knew you were Steve's mate.
Yeah.
They were going to trust you before they were going to trust a counsellor. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's how it worked out in the end. You know, I think a big part of it was, yeah, I was Steve's right hand man, and they trusted Steve. I think a big part of it was, you know, I was pretty much there from the early days, so I was a familiar face. And I think also people just decided, well, I've got to count on somebody, so I'm going to count on Steve. I'm going to count on Jamie and the team, because that's what I need to do, you know. So there were counselors from outside that came in, and some of them were a great help. Some of them weren't, you know, to be honest. In any disaster, people come in from everywhere telling you, you know, they've got the silver bullet to solve all your problems.
Yes.
90% of them are a waste of time.
Yes.
But there are some wonderful people that come in and help and get it.
Yeah.
We were sort of fortunate. We had a number of case managers that were, well, they were all council employees. Some of them were from that area. Some of them grew up in Grantham, and knew the people and had a bit of rapport already. So we were lucky. But you had to build that trust. And let me tell you, a regional community that has just suffered a major disaster, it's not easy. So it takes a lot of cups of tea, cups of tea.
Now, I'm not going to give away everything that happens in the book, because that's why people have to buy it. So, and I'll also point out a little reminder, everybody, the chat button, if you have questions about the specifics of moving the town and would like to discuss them here, please put those in, because I'm going to move ahead slightly to say, you know, at the end of this, you move people. You've gotten through this together. You are like, I think I say that, you know, every disaster movie has a hero and an offsider. So that's you and Steve. That's the way I see it. I'm not going to ask who's the hero and who's the sidekick, who's Batman and who's Robin. But then, you know, you stayed around for a while, didn't you? I mean,
I did.
Your job seemed to move to Grantham, back to Grantham.
Yeah,
around there.
It did. And so yes, we had people in homes by Christmas.
Yes.
So we were successful, but finishing off the Grantham project probably took another year or two, really, because you know, we had to get all the homes together. There were people who needed some help. We had to manage all the finances and funds, and, you know, so it was a lengthy project from that regard, but it pretty much wound up after 2.5 years. But I started helping Steve with a lot of different things. And, you know, over the years, because I live in Sanford on the north side of Brisbane, it was an hour 20 commute every morning and an hour 20 commute back every evening.
Suburbs, if you live in Sydney, that's every day.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, these days that's fine. But I just really enjoyed being with Steve. You know, we had a lot of fun together. We traveled. We got asked to go all over the world to talk about Grantham. You know, we were in Japan, we were in New Zealand, Singapore, you know, and it was always exciting, because with being in the passenger seat of the Steve jet, there was always something fun, you know.
Yeah.
So I stayed for 5 years.
So tell me, how did that end? Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, in 2016, I got a call from Steve. He was going to a meeting, and I got a call on the side. We were on, you know, he would call me 3 times a day, and usually at 5 a.m. and at 7 p.m, you know. But he was driving to this meeting, and I was in the office, and he called and he said, oh, you know, having a bit of a laugh about, you know, his mate who got bit in the balls by a redback spider and had to help him out.
Say that again?
Yeah, his mate got bit in the balls by a redback spider, so he had to take him to the doctor. So he was running a bit late for the meeting. Steve, every day.
In that, yeah. That side of the world, yeah.
That's right. Every day there was something crazy going on. But so I said, you know, all right, well, keep going. He would always pull over when talking on the phone. So I said, you know, keep moving. And so then I got a call about half an hour later, and they said, oh, Steve passed out at this meeting, and, you know, you might want to come down and help, you know, come to the hospital. And I just thought he was dehydrated or something. It was a hot day. So I sort of took my time getting to the hospital. And by the time I got to the hospital in Ipswich, he had taken a bad turn, and he'd had essentially had a stroke. And then, you know, we were there in the hospital with his family, and that was a real difficult time. But then after about 2 days, we had the family made the decision to turn off the life support, and Steve passed away, and that was in January 2016.
So like 5 years almost.
Almost to the day. Yeah.
That must have been incredibly traumatic after going through so much together. You spoke at the funeral, didn't you?
Yeah.
And then tell me afterwards, where did you helped carry that great big coffin out?
Yes, yeah, we did.
Yeah. And
yeah.
Where did you?
Myself and one of the other council guys and Steve's sons. He has 3 sons. We carried the casket out. We, you know, at that time we were happy to make jokes and laugh. You know, he was a big man, so you had to get your strength together. And the funeral director came up with the idea a few days earlier. He had a very old Buick Hearst, a 1924 Hearst. And Steve was always into old trucks and cars, and we thought this would be perfect. And when that pulled up, it was just immaculate vehicle, you know, just beautiful. Just, it had been looked after perfectly, and it was just really special. So we loaded him up in the back of that Hearst, and we drove out. There was a couple thousand people at the funeral. So it was a huge funeral. And then we drove through the town, and there were people lining the streets saying their goodbyes. And we drove, and there was just a small group of us in a couple of cars, just mainly family and close friends, heading out to the cemetery. And by chance, the cemetery was, Grantham was on the way to the cemetery. So
on you.
The old Grantham, the road going right through old Grantham. And as we started to get close, the hearse, it was a hot day, and the hearse just started to slow down. And I'm thinking, oh man, what's going on here? And there she died right in the heart of old Grantham, at the epicenter of the flood. The hearse died.
That feels like something special there. That wasn't just a chance. I feel like maybe you wanted a last goodbye or something.
I think so. I think the universe pulled up, you know, at that point and said, we're gonna let Steve have a look at this one last time.
Yeah.
And you know, I remember getting out, and Steve's boys were there, and we had a laugh, but it was weird. It was incredible.
Sure. For sure. You know, the side of what was actually a great achievement, really, you know, a huge achievement of his life. Now you didn't, but you at that point, that must have been just, I don't want to use, is the straw that broke the camel's back? I mean, is that fair?
I think so. You know, I mean, when Steve died, that was the reason I was out there working. You know, I mean, I have a passion for regional communities for sure, and I liked it out there, but I liked working with Steve, and we had always talked about doing more stuff, and we always had plans. We always had little schemes up our sleeve that we were going to do, and you know, there was always something exciting. And when Steve died, that just turned off for me. And so to me, that was kind of the end of an era. So a few weeks later, you know, I cleaned up. I said, you know, I'm out of here.
You went and reintroduced yourself to the children who hadn't seen you for 5 years.
Exactly right. I went and met my children and my wife, for the second time. And basically we just, as a family, we just sort of switched off, and we drove through Europe for a little while and drove around America for a little while, and just tried to get back to basics. And I had to sort of regroup and rethink about my future, because you know, when someone like that is so prevalent in your life, and he's such a strong figure in your life, and he was my best mate, you know, realistically, he was my best mate. And so not only did I lose him, but I also lost that passion for the work that I was doing. And so I sort of turned off for a little while and just regrouped.
So it doesn't sound like you're ready to jump in to write a book. Some people think of a book as soon as something like this happens. They're usually in the media. What brought you to write a book? So
for years, I didn't think much about Grantham. And I thought about Steve all the time, of course, but Grantham was kind of a mixed memory for me. You know, it was a very difficult time, that project, but it was a successful one, and it was a very rewarding one. But it reminded me of Steve and all those sorts of things, so I kind of turned off to it. But out of the blue, last year, I got contacted by a group in Brisbane, a flood group, that actually been doing some good work with them. They invited a professor from the States over, who dealt with this concept called managed retreat, which I'd never really heard of. But he called me up, this guy from from America, and through this contact, and he said, "Hey, you know, I've heard about Grantham. I study this idea of relocating towns, and I've heard stories of Grantham, but I'd like to find someone who knows something about it. And, you know, do you know anything? Have you ever heard of Grantham? Do you know anything about it?" So I said, "Well, yeah, I guess I know a few things. About it. What do you want to know?" And he was in Australia at the time, down in Sydney, and he said, "Can I come up? Can you take me out to Grantham?" I said, "Absolutely." So we flew up, and I drove him out to Grantham. We spent the day out there, and that was the first time I'd been in Grantham since Steve's hearse died in Grantham.
Wow.
So it was all pretty emotional for me, I suppose, to look at the town and talk about the story.
The one who suggested to you that you write a book, or was it more the fact that this is obviously an issue that's becoming more important, more prevalent around the world because of climate change? So is that?
Yeah. Well, that's what happened, and I didn't realize at the time how successful Grantham was on the world scale. So he studied this idea of relocating from disasters around the world, and he was blown away by what happened in Grantham. You know, the best cases in America take 3 to 4 years and cost 3 times as much. So he invited me. That day, he said, "I want you to fly to America. We're going to do a tour of American towns that have relocated. I want you on there. I want you to talk about it." And on that tour, he convinced me to write. He said, "I need you to write a research paper because your story has to be told, because there is no manual for relocating towns. And that is becoming a bigger thing with more prevalent disasters and, you know, sea level rise, all this sorts of thing." And he said, "You know, I need you to write something." And so what started out as a 4-page research paper, I promised him I could do 4 pages and turned into a book.
Now, I've got an eye on the time here, because we want to leave some time for people's questions. You know, I think you and I both know we can both talk underwater. I certainly have asked more questions about that, particularly about, I think, you know, community change and climate change and all of the things we're dealing with at the moment. But instead, I'm going to ask you one last question before we open up to questions. And that's it. So what was more traumatic, moving a town or writing a book?
Well, writing a book is a pain in the ass. Writing a book is painful. And particularly having to read your book over and over. You know, writing, it's one thing, but then having to go back and read it 3 times over, you're like, "Oh, if I got to read this damn thing one more time." So yeah. I would have to say writing a book is a painful exercise.
Yeah, well, you know, I maybe there are people who enjoy the process all the time, but I'm yet to meet. I know.
I am not one.
Yeah, somebody who's editing at the moment, there is a point where you just want somebody to take it off you and do anything else. So people, I just firstly, as I said, I've got plenty more questions. I love chatting to you because I think it's such an interesting skill set, as they say, just an interesting experience. But thanks, Jamie, because this is, it's really amazing. I'm even going to hold up the book. There you go.
Oh, yes. I got a copy here too. Yeah.
That's better. But thank you for writing. Thanks for the chat. And people, can we open it up? It just says it's avid reader. I can't say.
Yeah.
It's avid reader. Would you like to ask the question?
Yep. I have been sent a few questions now. The first one I'll read is, Jamie, we've got some international listeners in the audience. How applicable is this to a little place like the Netherlands? What might make a relocation happen there? And this is a question from Pete from the Flood Community of Practice.
Thanks, Pete. Yes, it's a great question, because I guess the question really is about what learnings can people get from my experience, you know. And I get this question a fair bit. And I don't want to tell people, well, moving a town is always the right answer, and you just follow this 8-step plan and there you go. It's not quite that simple, but I think the most important thing with any of these things is what I learned on day one, is that it's about community. You know, it's about people. If you come at it from an engineering side, or if you come at it from a town planning side, or from an architectural side, you're going to struggle. But if you come at it from a people side and a community side, you took the first step. You know, once you realize that you've got to somehow harness the community, and after disasters and things like that, you know, and you see it now with the coronavirus. You know, I go running now. I used to see 3 people on my morning run. Now I see 30 people out there, because the community is just looking for reasons to have hope and looking for people to link with. You get that in disasters, and you've got to harness that. And you've got to, you know, you've got to start with that. So if you start thinking about community and what that community needs moving forward, you know, that's the right step. I hope that's answered Pete's question.
Pete also asked, what does the Grantham community in the relocated place say about what happened?
So that's a great question. So I spoke to a number of people in Grantham, and I know, you know, different people have spoken, and I've gotten contacted from a lot of different people in Grantham, and it's exciting. I think by and large, the feedback I get is it was a real difficult time, you know, and no one can give them back what they had on January 9th, 2011. But the relocation gave them hope, and it gave them purpose, and they're happy. You know, they talk to me about, you know, and as anybody knows, you know, regional people, you get them on the phone, they could talk your ear off, and they're talking about, you know, it's so dry, or it's so wet, or the neighbors need some help with this or that. When they're talking about those sort of things, you know, it's work, because they're not telling me about, oh, I still have nightmares, or the community's still struggling, or so-and-so committed suicide, or so-and-so is having trouble and they got divorced. You know, they're talking about normal things, which that was all we wanted at the end of the day. We just wanted people to get back to some new normal. So I think by and large, we achieved that in Grantham, which is exciting.
I have another question from Jody, Jamie. She says, I loved hearing your story on Conversations, and again tonight. It rings very true to home, having grandparents who lived in Gatton and spending lots of time in that area. Did you ever question it or think you wouldn't make the Christmas deadline?
Oh, what a great question. I can probably say it now because Steve's dead. But yeah, I mean, I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't worried about that, you know, and I think we all were. And to be honest, I think Steve was. But when you are I guess that hope, when you're what people are looking towards to believe in something, you put your head down and you keep plowing ahead. And did I have doubts? I sure did. But I can honestly say that those doubts never slowed me down. They never stopped me, and they never stopped Steve. You might have those doubts, but you're going to die trying, if that's what it comes to, you know. And Steve was built like that as well, that we were going to, if we didn't get there, someone was going to have, you know, there was going to be a damn good reason. So we fought every single day. And when you go in with that kind of bravado and that kind of confidence on the surface, very few people want to say no to you. And that's something I talk about in the book, is for a few months there, we could have done just about anything, and no one would have slapped the handcuffs on us. So were we breaking rules? We sure were. But Anna Bligh herself wasn't going to come out and put us in the shackles. So, which was kind of fun, to be honest.
Pete commented that ambition was high and you guys did it. Thank goodness Steve had that vision. And Claire Louise is asking, what would have happened to Grantham if you didn't have a leader like Steve to drive it?
Yeah, another good question. And I guess it comes back to leadership. And, you know, everybody talks about leadership, but, you know, I think Grantham would have become a ghost town, you know, and that's what we were really running from, is the idea that Grantham, like so many other regional communities, they're marginal at the best of times. You know, they're hanging on, the shop owners just hanging on, the butcher's just hanging on, the cafe is just hanging on. If we didn't get in there and help out, I think we would have seen a ghost town. And that's, I guess, a message for other disaster areas. You know, if you don't have that leadership and you don't have that activity and that action quickly, you run the risk of having nobody left.
I think it's have we got any more questions? Because I was going to make an observation otherwise.
We absolutely make the observation. Then we have one more, and then I'll ask for any final comments.
Jamie, I was going to say, one of the things that really struck me as well is that, I mean, people get paid an enormous amount of money as consultants to do sort of political and media management, and yet you guys seem to instinctively manage both, often against each other. I think it'd be interesting. You said Anna Bligh wouldn't dare come out and slap handcuffs on you. It seems like Steve knew if he used the media in the right way, nobody was going to touch you because there was a great story going on. Is that right?
That's right. And that was the big game. And I talk about it in the book. A lot of it was a game, and without, you know, most people don't see what happens behind those closed doors. But so much of it is just that you've got to, we use the media in the best way we could. And you're right, it was just instinct. We were just winging it. But we use the media to say, here's a devastated community, but instead of them crying that they need more help, here's a positive action. Here's a positive activity. And this is what we're going to do. We told you we were going to move the town. Well, today, take a picture of the dozer pushing over the first tree. Today, take a picture of the guys pouring the first asphalt. Today, take a picture of the guys going up to the estate and having a look at their new block.
And it's a very brave premier or prime minister or bureaucrat who then says, no, you can't do that because you haven't, you know, filled out the right paperwork, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And there was a lot of paperwork that was not filled out when we were launching those things. So it's amazing what a press conference can do for your bureaucratic red tape. Yeah. And it comes back, and I talk about it in the book too, the funding for it and the financing. We use the media very strongly to make sure we got our check, make sure we got support.
It felt like a bit of a cat and mouse game or a game of bluff, wasn't it? Like even
absolutely.
Geordie Gillard, when you met with her, it was always
that's right.
Almost daring them to say no.
Right. Exactly. That's how it turned out, and we were nervous about it, but I guess if you got enough bluff and enough bravado, it's like Kenny Rogers says, every hand's a winner and every hand's a loser. You know, you take the hand you got, and you make it into four aces, and away you go. You know.
Thank you.
Amanda has commented and said, a brilliant read and a couple of amazing men. We need more leaders like these, two inspirational men who would not take no for an answer and stuck with it until they solved the problems. Thank you. And we have our last question from Leonor. The question is, I can imagine the process of building a new town on the hill. What did you do with the remains of the old town?
Oh, another good question. Well, we made a commitment very early on that any land, so we did a land swap. So we took the landowner's block on the flooded area and gave them a block in the new estate. So with the old land, we made a commitment that it would never be developed on again for residential purposes, or you know, so we were really strong about that. So if you go into Grantham today, there still are a few houses that didn't take up the land swap, but the vast majority did. So you'll see a few houses there, but you'll see a lot of the land has been returned to agriculture. So we made a real conscious effort to to lease that land. So council took ownership of that land, and we made a conscious effort to lease that land back to local farmers and just get them growing stuff on it. And you'll see that there's horses out there on some of the blocks, and try to make it look like it's not a patchwork community. It's meant there. So if you drive through Grantham today, it's very difficult to identify that as being a relocated town. It just kind of, the town sort of works. So unless I went out there with you and told you what happened and who owns what block, it's really difficult to tell, which is exactly what we wanted.
I'm going to squeeze, is it all right if I ask one last question?
Sure.
We have one from Greg, and then I'm going to unmute everybody so that we can say thank you to Jamie and Christine for this wonderful conversation this evening. It's been fantastic. Thank you both so much. The last question is from Greg. It is, can you imagine a community discussing to move their town if not being hit by a major disaster first? Can a good analysis of the facts and risks get people moving?
That is such a difficult question, and I've chewed that over in writing the book and so many things. What motivates people to do something like what we did? You know, from my point of view in Grantham, I think the answer is if Steve and I went into Grantham before that flood happened, and we said, hey everybody, you know, one day this town could be flooded, we're going to move you up on the hill, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. So from that point of view, I don't think it could have happened without that disaster. And also, to be totally honest, without the loss of life, the significant loss of life. Now, however, moving forward, we're seeing more disasters. We're seeing more trauma in the world. And I, you know, not to wade into a climate change debate, but, you know, it seems like there are more disasters and more significant disasters and more severe disasters. Is there a time where I think people will proactively do this? I do think that's the case. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the book. Because if there's a community out there that's saying, geez, you know, one big rainstorm and we're going to be wiped out, and they pick up my book and they have a read and they say, hey, you know what, this stuff is possible, it can happen, then, you know, that might be the thing that gets them across the line, you know. So in the future, do I think people are going to proactively do this? I do. I think they're going to have to.
Lovely. Well, I might unmute everybody now, as this is 1 minute till 7:30. So please join me as soon as I find the chat window, which I have. Thanks for pointing that out earlier, Christine, but now I'm the one who needs a hand with it. Here we go, I found it. So I'm going to unmute everybody now, and we can give Christine and Jamie a round of applause and say thank you for the evening.
Thanks.
There we go. Thank you all again so much for joining us. Please send me a message. I'll hang around for a little bit as you are leaving to send you the link if you require it.
Hello, Gregor from the Netherlands. Hey man, alles goed?
Alles goed. Are you going to Zambrero to pick up an order? The address details for that order are incorrect.
Fantastic, Jamie. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Christine.
Well done, it's much closer than that.
Thank you.
Well done, Jamie. Thank you.
Thanks,
It's
man.
much closer
Fast be
than the
quiet.
address that you've been given.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Given now is much closer.
Cheers, Jamie. That was great, mate. Well done.
Thanks, Pete.
No shortage of questions, hey? We could talk all night. We want to stay on and have a drink now.
You give an American. Yeah, you give a Yank a microphone.